I know some people are still making their way in, but time is short. We need to end on time today, so let us get underway. Good morning, and welcome back for this closing plenary session of the 2014 AGN conference. And as I said earlier, today, on the first day, we focused on peace. On yesterday, on political governance. And this morning, we are going to focus on solidarity. And as Europe continues to grasp with the aftermath of the economic and financial crisis, and all eyes are on the turmoil in Ukraine, this is a word, solidarity, that is much talked about. But then when it comes to discussing what it actually means, it can lead to some fairly bitter arguments. So, how important is the notion of solidarity to Rethinking Europe? Is there a common understanding in Europe of what it actually means in practice? And what impact does this have on the way we view ourselves, our communities and societies, our relationship with the European Union and with international institutions? And absolutely crucially, and as in other plenaries, what does this mean for all of you, for the work of foundations? Solidarity, just by way of introduction, has already come up in all the plenaries. The Minister, Sarajevo Maglic, said in the opening session, "We can get by, but with a little help from our friends," quoting the Beatles songs. There is, as you know, and I mentioned yesterday, the Sarajevo statement on Ukraine coming out of this conference, and it has been mentioned in every session. Within the EU, Janis Reiter underlined the importance of restoring cohesion within and between member states if you were to have real peace and stability. And in our political governance session yesterday, great deal of emphasis on the need to tackle inequalities, to have that solidarity, because it is a sense that there is not that solidarity that looks like it will risk a huge populist backlash in next week's European elections. So this really has underpinned all of our discussions. I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker in a minute. We're going to have a keynote speech, and then I'm going to bring some young people up to discuss these issues with me and with the professor. But first, it is my honor and privilege to introduce Jaroslav Rycak, who is a professor of history, director of the Peter Jacek Program for Studies of Modern Ukrainian History and Society at the University of Alberta, director of the Institute for Historical Research at the Ivan Franko National University of Lviv, and chair of Modern World History at the Ukrainian Catholic University, and author of numerous publications. Yaroslav, it is fantastic to have you with us. I know it was difficult to get away from Ukraine under the circumstances. You're much in demand, so we are very honored to have you here. Over to you.
Thank you so much.
Don't use, you can either use the headset or that, but not both.
I would rather use the headset.
Perfect, yeah, just talk. Should be.
Does it work?
Should be fine.
There is some strange sounds in between, which is not mine. Thank you so much, Jackie, for your kind introduction, kind words. I don't really deserve them, but they soothe enormously my ego. I have written a paper, but I won't read it for two reasons. First of all, because I read even worse than I speak. And secondly, because I literally turn it apart in some pieces, because I wanted to reflect upon and react to some points that has been raised during discussion during the last 2.5 days. And I would like to start by congratulating the organizer of this conference with the choice of the place, Sarajevo. It was a very smart move, because in many senses, Sarajevo is a very potent symbol. It's a symbol of the 20th century, which was now the century of extreme, century of violence and blood, and we all hope that is now behind of us. But there is awareness or fear that actually it may well be also the symbol of the century which we now living. And Ukraine, unfortunately, very much unfortunately, seems to testify this dangerous tendency. In many ways, Ukrainian situation, and I am a specialist in Ukrainian situation, I'm teaching history or writing history of 19th, 20th century Eastern Europe, so I could say confidently from my professional point of view, in many sense, Ukrainian history bear many resemblance to Sarajevo or to Balkans. So it was been Ukraine quite often be referred in 20th century as the Balkans of the Eastern Europe, and there was some Serbian creation scenario has always been looming over Ukraine. Suffice it to say that 20 years ago, CIA came with a prognosis And this prognosis has been done amidst the deep political economical crisis in Ukraine. And this prognosis sounds like that Ukraine is heading to a civil war between Western, Ukrainian-speaking West and Russian-speaking East, some kind of symbols of Croatia and Serbia, in comparison with which, and here I'm quoting verbatim, Yugoslav war would look like innocent picnic. This was 20 years ago. Fortunately enough, nothing has happened along these lines, but we still live with the awareness of this kind of threat, and most unfortunately now it seems to start realize. But as you may know, every comparison is lame. There's also some kind of which runs beyond the kind of this kind of comparative framework. So I would say that yes, in many senses, Ukraine is very much like a Sarajevo or Balkan, this kind of symbol of 20th century. But it's also very important to see the differences, because I believe this is exactly what Putin wants us to believe. Very much like a CIA prognosis, that the civil war along the Serbian, Croatian, or Yugoslav scenario is imminent in Ukraine. And to that effect, Putin focusing on identities. Russian speakers versus Ukrainian speakers, West versus East, Orthodox versus Catholics, something like this kind, all this kind of Huntington-like scenario. I would say if we will follow this rhetoric, we won't understand what was really going in Ukraine, specifically for the last 3 or 4 months, the events that they call European Maidan. Because this was not about identities. It was not about language or religion. It was about corruption. It was about a right of the people to live in dignity, to exercise their basic rights, liberal rights, all these kind of things. Say there is a surveys in Ukraine constantly going on, and they seem to confirm one pattern. When people are asked about their main concerns, the main problem, the answer will be always unemployment, corruption, and security. And identities always come at the bottom of the list. So if we focus on identities, we won't really get what was really happening in Ukraine. Because in many ways, what was going on in Ukraine may be called, at least the people in Ukraine called themselves so, was revolution of values, or revolution of dignity. And this is more than just a nice metaphor. Some of you may know there is one very interesting study, survey, that's made on the global scale, which is called World Value Studies. It has been initiated some 50 years ago. Then at the beginning of the 80s, then it covered only a few countries. Now it covers practically all the countries of the world. And since the fall of the Berlin Wall, it's also covered the communist, post-communist space, including Ukraine and Russia. So what is interesting to observe, if you look on this survey, and it's available on the internet, you could just Google World Value Survey, you will see it immediately. So if you look on the way how values evolve, say in Russia and Ukraine, you will be surprised to what extent Ukraine and Russia are drifting apart for the last 20 years. For sure, Russia is getting bigger, richer and richer. But at the same time, it's much more surprise. The values of the Russian populations evolve into the values of so-called closed society, so-called revival, thing like that. The something has a very strong feeling of xenophobia, intolerance, and things like that. Why in Ukraine, for 20 years, especially for the last 10 years since the Maidan of 2004, we have a shift. And this is kind of the evident shift to the values of the self-expression, which people, even so, Ukraine is much more, say, is poorer than Russia. This is kind of different direction, and this could be seen on this kind of the map that's presented by this survey. So if you look a clue from this survey, so this seems like Putin and his regime seems to be something like a natural for Russia, given the values that the majority of Russians presents. And vice versa, Yanukovych and his regime seems like a system failure, some kind of short episode. Therefore, it was not hard to predict that Ukraine is standing on the verge of a very serious political crisis or revolution. As a matter of fact, several people, including me, did this kind of prediction a year before, that we are heading to some kind of very important political events in Ukraine. And basically, this shift of values, this is connected with the emergence of the groups. They are probably not that large, but they are very important. The first group is the new middle class. Why I'm emphasizing the new? Because we have a middle class before, but this is some kind of new quality. This is middle class, which is not necessarily intelligentsia, as used to be in the 19th, 20th century. Secondly, because in comparison to these oligarchs who made the money and the fortune in the 90s, they are not connected to the state. And more often than not, they do their business within the post-industrial service industry. This is very different type, like design, IT technology, something like that, and they're numerous, especially in the large cities. And the second is probably much more important. It's the emergence of new generation. We call this generation period of independence. They have been born, say, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which means they do not remember anything about all good Soviet times, and therefore they behave very differently. And this is probably the main group that has the most evident values of the self-expression. Again, I'm referring to these values, but the survey shows that what we now in Ukraine, we have something like a generation gap. In the sense that many young Ukrainians, on the age of, say, from the 18 to 29, in terms of their values, they are more closer to a peer group in Germany, in Poland, or some other European country than to Ukrainians of my generation. So my point is here, and I want to reiterate it several times, if I may. So regardless of many similarities that they have between Maidan of 2004, Orange Revolution, and nowadays Euromaidan, those are two very distinct phenomena. Because I would say that Euromaidan